Hello, my name's Andy Tyrrell, and here's my contact details down the bottom here, my email. And so we're going to spend three lectures and a few workshops, probably 4 or 5 workshops on this module, Critical Evaluation of Intelligent Robotic Systems. And the way I'm going to do this is, as I said, there are 3 lectures, but each lecture I will divide up into 2 or 3 parts. So there'll be 15, 20-minute parts to give you a small chunk each time to give you a rest in between. But so ultimately there'll be 3 lectures, as I said, but divided up. So this is the first part of lecture 1, and it's really just an introduction to the idea of what we're going to be doing on this module, and give you a couple of examples and also talk about the assessment so that you're aware of what's coming up. Okay, so let's start off just talking about the aim of the module. So it's very important when you go out into industry, or maybe you want to go into a research career, that you can think carefully and critically about things that you read, about what other people have written, and actually analyze things rather than taking everything as read, to actually start thinking critically about what people have applied. So this is what this lecture is all about. This is what this series of lectures is about. It's to apply what you've learned in many respects on this module, on these modules already within the MSc, and actually evaluate the literature. So actually look at research in a particular area and decide whether there are gaps in the area, whether people have actually done experiments properly, and the conclusions that they've made typically in papers that they've written, whether those conclusions are backed up by the results that they've given in those papers or those articles. Excuse me. So what we want to do in the module, as I said, is to start getting you to think critically, evaluating what other people have written. So it's to allow you to get the experience of critical thinking, critical evaluation, critical thinking. It's to provide you with some research training, to actually finding the right literature and finding those resources. So often it's actually it's not as easy as you think it is to actually find the right literature and the appropriate resources in a particular research area for you to make some conclusions. So as I said, obviously in the research world, we do this all the time. And ultimately we end up writing our own scientific papers. But even if you went into work for a company, in that company, they might say, okay, well, we want to move into this new area. We want to come up with a new product. And the question is, what else is out there? And how does it work? And how does it perform? And so this idea of actually looking at the literature and evaluating it is really important skill to have. And then ultimately, again, either in academia where we write journal papers and conference papers, or if you worked in industry and your boss might want you to write a review paper to decide whether you're going to move into that area, whether he's going to spend money to move into that new area, the likelihood is you have to write up this work that you've done, this thinking that you've done, into a scientific report. And so whether that's going to be a peer-reviewed paper or just a report for your boss at work, you need to do that properly. So this module will give you experience at doing both of those things. Okay, so let me just give you a brief example, and we'll come back to this particular example a bit later on. So this is a paper, and the important thing with this, and this is something that you'll want to keep an eye on when you start doing your own work, is it actually talks about a literature review. You see here in the title, it says a literature review. In this particular case, it's optimization of legged robots. Okay, so it's just a kind of a random example for me, just to illustrate a few things to you, and hopefully you'll actually read this paper soon to actually have a bit better idea. But the important thing for you when you're starting off is this idea of a literature review, because the hope is that that's going to be talking about a lot of different things that other people have already done. Okay, so let me just stop sharing my PowerPoint for the minute, and let me share this paper. Okay, so what we can see, here we go, a literature review, optimization of legged robots. Okay, so that's the paper I was talking about. So as most of you, I'm sure, already know, the structure of the paper, it starts off with an abstract, which gives you kind of a very, very fast overview of what you're doing. And there's a bit of background at the start, and we'll talk about abstracts in a couple of lectures time. But it starts off with a bit of background, and then it tells you what this paper does. So, okay, so the paper presents a review of the literature of different methods adopted for the optimization of the structure of locomotion gates for walking robots. Okay, for legged robots, as the title says. So that gives you an idea, gives you an impression of what the paper's about. Let's hope it actually does that. Let's hope it actually does what it says. And then it starts off with an introduction, really. So the idea of the introduction is really to place the paper so the reader knows whether they actually want to carry on, really, and read it. So it talks about the problem. It talks here about the problem. And really what it's saying is that legged robots have, they're traditionally have advantages over what we might see as more obvious robots with wheels and tracks type thing. The problem is, as it says here, at least 50% of the world's surface actually isn't nice and smooth, and therefore wheeled and tracked robots have problems getting over them. And so, you know, there's a justification for saying that legged robots might be quite useful. Okay, so this paper, the review paper, before it starts looking at what other people have done, it actually talking about why you'd want to do that. Okay, so that's a nice introduction, and it talks a bit more about that. And then if we go on down the paper, okay, so it then talks about the problem. So we're saying, okay, yeah, we want legged robots. They're really good. They're better than wheeled robots in many situations, but there are some problems. And let's see, if we look at the current developments, so papers that people have produced, what the issues are and how people have got on. Okay, and then so if we go down now then, okay, let me go down. So it's then divided up into a number of sections. And if we look at evolutionary strategies as an example, so it talks about a few papers, it talks about some papers. And then what it says down here is, okay, so here we go. The main criticism of the design approach based on evolutionary strategies, which is what this section's about, lays in its convergence. So it lays in the thing about evolutionary strategies is it comes up with random examples and it tries to converge down to the best solution. And what it's saying here is okay, there's a problem with that. Okay, and it says, in fact, there are some uncertainties about achieving a solution. It means achieving a solution at all. So it may not actually find a solution. Okay, due to the high complexities needed for a robot to be of practical use. Okay, so what you'll see here is it's talked about up here. If you read I'll get you to read this paper in more detail. But what you see up here is it talks about what people have done. It talks about various authors, various papers. You see, and these are referenced here by the people's names: Libson and Pollock, Hornby, etc. Endo. Okay, so lots of different papers. And then what it does, it critically looks at those and it says, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. But there's a problem. There's a problem with these. Actually, this is a bit of an issue when it comes to using evolutionary methods. So what it's done is it's critically evaluated a number of papers with regard to that. And here's another example. And this is one where it's actually identifying a generic problem. No matter whether you use evolutionary techniques or others. So concerning the weakness of artificial locomotion systems in general, okay, one of the most serious problems faced by legged, screen down, robots, designers is optimization of the energy consumption of the robot, okay, of these designs. Okay, so that's actually identifying a generic problem which these authors of this paper have identified by reading all of these papers, critically and come up with a problem. Okay, so I'm not going to go into particularly a lot of details of this one for now. We'll come back to it and I'll get you to read it later. If we go down to the bottom of the paper where the conclusions are, okay. So as it says down here, the underlined bit, however, as stated previously, in their present state of development, there are several aspects that have to be improved and optimized. And the one that they really pick up here is the high energy consumption when compared to traditional forms of locomotion. So, you know, as I said, if you were being asked to look at legged robots and come up with recommendations for your boss, then what this is saying is, okay, there seems to be a gap in the literature which is really focusing on energy consumptions of leg robots. So if you're a company that were designing leg robots, then that might be something that your company says, okay, yeah, this is something that we could focus on to make us stand out in the field. Okay. Or in the literature, if you're working in a research lab at a university, then you might say, starting your PhD, you might say, okay, actually, yeah, this would be a really good area for me to look at my PhD. Okay, so what I want to do now is go back to the presentation. So let me stop sharing that screen. And go back to this one. Okay, so we've looked at this article briefly. We'll come back to it. So that's just a kind of a snippet of the sort of things that we might want to be doing in this module, that you might want to be doing when you're starting to read papers. So what we're going to do in the module, well, it's basically divided up into two. So one is actually gathering background, gathering the papers that you might want to see. And the second part of it is actually more of a technical focus for actually identifying the gaps in the literature. And what we'll see in your report, and I'll come to this in a minute, will be actually coming up with some ideas of what that gap is. Okay, so as it says here, what we're going to start off by doing is thinking about critical thinking and critical reading. So not believing everything that you just read as being true. You know, this is maybe slightly different from what you're used to when you're an undergraduate. So when your lecturer said something, or when you read a book, you assumed everything was correct. You assumed that it was true. Well, what you'll find is when you dig deeper, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes experiments haven't been done as well as they should have been, meaning that the conclusions aren't 100% true, or they may be true, but actually the paper doesn't back that up, and more experiments would be needed. And then the second part, as I said, we're going to look at a more technical view. We're going to look at identifying gaps in the literature, in a particular part of the literature, and we're going to spend a bit of time thinking about the report structure, the narrative, the story, that as you write your report, and then some simple ways of avoiding errors and how you edit things. That's what the rest of this module is going to be about. So let me tell you a little bit about the form of the assessment. So what will happen is that there's going to be a series of subjects that I will have sent you, that we put online for you to choose from, and you will choose a project. And there isn't an assumption that you know anything about the area, so don't worry about that. That's what the project's all about. So you'll get that this term, and then you'll spend quite a few weeks doing some background reading, and the assessment isn't due until week 7 of next term, week 7 of the summer term. And we're looking at you producing a document which are around about 15 pages, 9 to 10,000 words. And the structure should be like this, as it shows here in this table. So after the introduction, the idea is that these two bits are quite closely related. So you'll give a literature review, so a bit like the paper I just showed you, okay? And then you'll identify some gaps in the literature. So having read the literature, you'll identify some gaps that you think need to be solved. And the next part of the report, we're actually saying, okay, well, you're not going to have time to solve those gaps, but actually formulate a potential solution. How might you solve those gaps? What might you do? What experiments might you do? We won't be expecting you to do them. There isn't enough time. But what experiments might you do to solve that solution? Are there any ethical issues to do with that, with your potential solution? And what future work would you do if you had the time to actually formulate that potential? So, you know, if you were going to start a PhD, if you were going to start a 3-year PhD, how would you start that future work? And then you'll finish off with a summary and conclusions, as all good assessments would be. Okay, so that's just to give you an idea, and we will talk about that again in a lot more detail in the coming lectures. Okay, that's the end of the first part of lecture 1. This is just a silly video, just to amuse you at the end of this particular part of the lecture. Interesting what these people said about their robots in their papers, or whether they said that they were fantastic walking robots, or that there were issues with them, because clearly, as this video shows, there are definitely some issues with those. As I said, that's the end of the first part of lecture 1. We'll start the next part of lecture 1 soon, but maybe you want a bit of a rest before you come to doing that. Okay, so for now, thank you very much, and and we'll get back to you soon. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye now.